Let's look at a few more example methods. The string class has a method called equals, and this is a critical method to understand. I put a screenshot of the method signature here on your note page. At this point, you should feel pretty familiar with identifying the method identifier, the parameters, and the return type. This particular method identifier is equals. The parameter is an object called an object. And it does have a return type. It's a Boolean or a true or false value. And we call this method using this type of syntax where we have to like make a string. So I made a string called name and stored the value Joe inside there. And then I want to call the method using my object. So my object's called name, calling my method, which is equals. I'm passing in a parameter, which is a string literal Joe. And that's going to check to see whether the object name contains the same sequence of characters as that string literal. And then it's going to store the result in my variable called result, which is a Boolean or true false value. Let's test it out in IntelliJ to see how that works. So I'm going to make a new variable. I'm going to call mine first name because I already have a variable called name in my program, and I'm just lazy and don't want to erase it. I'm going to compare the value of my first name string to the value of the string literal Joe. And then I'm going to print that out. Let me just print the result by itself. I'll label it, are these the same? You can see that it says true, Joe and Joe are the same. Let's try it with something else. Suppose that I compare it to Karen, that literal. We're expecting it to say false because those are not the same name. And sure enough, it does. We can also use it to compare two string variables. We don't have to have one of them be a literal, so I could compare my variable first name, that object, to my variable name, which I declared earlier, that's storing Karen. So we're checking to see if Joe and Karen are the same. We're expecting it to say false. So the equals method allows us to check to see whether the contents of two string variables are the same. And this is important because that is the absolute essential way that we have to compare string objects. Sometimes students want to compare string objects using the double equal sign. Let's test that out. So I'm going to call this result 1, and then I'm going to make a separate comparison where I say, is the first name equal to name? So this point, I'm comparing Joe to Karen. Let's check it out and see what those two variables return. So in this case, it says both of them are false, and that makes sense. That's what we'd expect. Those don't include the same name. Let's try this out. So suppose I let the user type in a name from standard input. I'm going to type in Karen at standard input. And when it compares Joe and Karen, it does say that those comparisons are false, regardless of whether I'm using the equal operator or the double equal sign operator. Let's try it again, but use Joe as the input. You can see that in this case, it gives confusing output. It tells me that comparing the two objects using the dot equals method returns true. It knows that Joe and Joe are the same, but using the double equal sign operator, it says they're false. Let's think about why that might be. Whenever you compare objects, string objects, or really any kind of objects, using the equal operator, it compares the memory address, the storage location of those two objects. So because my memory location that's referencing my name that's called name is different than the memory location that's referencing my object called first name, whenever I compare those two memory locations using the equal operator, I'm going to get a false answer, even if they contain the same characters. Now, usually when we're writing a program, we're not trying to compare the memory address of two strings. We want to compare the contents of two strings. And that's exactly why the equals operator or equals method exists, to successfully compare the contents of two objects, we need to use the equals method because it compares the contents of the method or contents of the objects, not the memory addresses. Let's look at one final method in the string library. This is called the compare to method. So the method identifier, that's the name of the method compare to. The parameters, that's the part that's inside the parentheses. So we have one parameter for this method. It's the string called another string. And this particular method has one return value. It's an int. Let's look at the Java documentation that describes what this method does. It says it compares two strings lexicographically. That's a really big word, and it sounds really complicated. What it actually means is it compares them alphabetically, but also in a case-sensitive way. So in other words, when it's comparing two strings lexicographically, it's comparing them alphabetically, but also recognizing that capital letters like capital A will come before the lowercase letters like lowercase a in a lexicographical sequence. So let's look at some examples about how to use this. This particular method returns an integer, but what does that integer represent? Let's test out the compare to method so we can appreciate how the return value indicates the ordering of the two strings that are being compared. I'm going to add on to my previous program. I'm going to simplify a little bit so it doesn't ask me for the input anymore. So it just runs our previous code. Let me just go back to, instead of asking for the input, let me just always have the name be equal to Joe. All right, so I'm going to add on something totally new and different down here. So I'm going to declare two different strings. I'll make one name one and store the value apple in that string. And then I'll make a second one, name two, I'll store banana in that one. And now suppose that I want to compare the contents of those two strings, the apple and the banana string. I can call the compare to method and store the integer result. So I'm going to say name one dot compare to name two, and then I'll print out the result. Super, let's run it. So we're comparing apple and banana, and apple is before banana. That means it'll return a negative return value when it does its comparison. Suppose that we change the word banana, or suppose that we change the word apple so that it stores orange. And now we run the program again. So orange before banana. You can see in this case, it gave us a positive value. That's because orange should be after banana. That's all pretty straightforward. Suppose we put banana in both strings. When we run it, now we get a return value of 0. That's because the two strings have the same contents. The compare to method returns a 0 value if the two strings being compared contain the same sequence of characters. It returns a negative number if the calling object, the one that comes before the period, should come before the parameter object lexicographically, and it returns a positive value if name one's contents should come after name two's contents lexicographically. Remember that the comparison is case sensitive. So if we have banana with a capital B, that won't test as being equivalent to banana with a lowercase b. Instead, we're getting a negative answer. That's because the capital letters always come before the lowercase letters when we compare lexicographically. So even if we change this and store zanana with a Z, that's still going to come before banana because the capital letter is lexicographically sooner in the alphabet than the lowercase versions. At this point, we've seen lots of examples of different methods that are part of the string class. Please continue to explore because there's so many useful methods that you can utilize in your own programs.